Gabriel Navarro's fist hit the marble table so hard the glass shattered. "Get him out of my sight!" The chef dropped to his knees begging, but Gabriel's bodyguard already had the man by the collar dragging him backward through the door, while the untouched plate of food slid to the floor. 18 months. 6 chefs. Not a single bite. The most feared crime boss in Chicago was rotting alive from the inside, and every man in that mansion knew it, but not one of them could do a damn thing about it. Until a plus-size maid from South Jersey walked through the service entrance with nothing but a duffel bag and her grandmother's recipes. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and stay with me until the very end. Because what happens next in this mansion is something none of us saw coming. The Navarro mansion sat on the north edge of Chicago like a fortress that had decided somewhere along the way to stop pretending it was a home. It had 34 rooms, 11 fireplaces, and a kitchen that had seen 6 different head chefs come and go in the past 18 months. Each one had arrived with credentials, with reputations, with crates of imported ingredients, and the quiet confidence of someone who had cooked for presidents and dignitaries, and people who knew the difference between a good meal and a great one. Each one had left with their tail between their legs, their pride shredded, and their paycheck cashed through a third party so that no one on the outside would ever know they had worked here. The reason they all failed stood at 6 feet 2 inches and weighed barely 158 pounds on a good morning. Gabriel Navarro, 53 years old, head of the most powerful organized crime family in the Midwest, was starving himself to death. Not by choice, not by illness in the clinical sense, but by fear. A fear so complete, so consuming, so layered into every waking moment of his life that the simple act of lifting a fork had become the most dangerous thing he could imagine doing. 18 months ago, on a Tuesday evening in October, Gabriel had sat down to a dinner of braised short ribs and roasted root vegetables in the private dining room of his favorite restaurant. He had taken 4 bites. By the time his driver had pulled the car around, Gabriel's vision was doubling. By the time they reached the hospital, his heart had stopped twice. The doctors called it a near miraculous recovery. His men called it a message. Gabriel called it a turning point, and not the kind that led anywhere good. They never found out exactly who had ordered it. There were suspects, theories, names whispered and crossed out and whispered again. But the truth was that in the world Gabriel Navarro inhabited, there were too many people with too many reasons to want him gone. And that realization, that cold and bottomless realization, had done something to him that the poison itself had not quite managed. It had taken away his appetite, not just for food, for trust. He had tried in the beginning to push through it. He had sat at his dining table every evening and forced himself to look at the plate in front of him. He had hired a food taster, an elderly Romanian man named Petru, who had done this work for a Bulgarian oligarch for 12 years, and had the steady hands and unshakable calm of someone who had long since made peace with the odds. Petru would eat first, wait 20 minutes, and then give Gabriel the nod. And still Gabriel could not eat. He would sit there watching the steam rise from the plate, and his throat would close like a fist, and his hands would begin to shake, and he would push the plate away and ask for one of the protein shakes his doctor had prescribed instead. The shakes were safe because Gabriel mixed them himself from sealed packages with water from bottles he had personally inspected. They tasted like chalk and disappointment, but they kept him alive. Barely. His doctor, a cautious and perpetually worried man named Dr. Ellison, visited every 2 weeks and delivered the same verdict with slightly increasing alarm each time. Gabriel was malnourished. His muscle mass was deteriorating. His immune system was compromised. His blood pressure, his organ function, his cognitive clarity, all of it was sliding in the wrong direction. Gabriel, Dr. Ellison had said at the last visit 3 weeks ago, standing in this very room with his charts in his concerned eyes, the human body can sustain itself on supplemental nutrition for a period of time, but it is not indefinite. You are approaching a threshold. If something does not change, something will change, Gabriel had said. Leave. And Dr. Ellison had left because that was what everyone did when Gabriel Navarro spoke in that tone. They left. They complied. They disappeared. The problem was that tone, that authority, that carefully maintained wall of command, it was costing Gabriel more energy than he had left to spend. Every morning he woke up and performed the role of himself, and every evening he collapsed into a chair by the window and stared out at the city lights and felt the hollowness insulated him, pressing outward from every direction. He was disappearing. He knew it. His men knew it. And the man who knew it best of all, who watched it with the most careful and calculating attention, was Deegan Butler. Deegan was 41, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, with the kind of face that photographs well and the kind of eyes that don't quite match the smile above them. He had been Gabriel's underboss for 6 years. He was efficient, disciplined, and deeply methodically ambitious in the way that only truly patient men can be. He had never once made a move against Gabriel directly. He had never needed to. He simply waited, managed positions, and watched the clock with the serene certainty of someone who had already decided how this particular story ended. Over the past 18 months, Deegan had quietly restructured several key relationships within the Navarro operation. He had placed his own people in positions that had previously reported directly to Gabriel. He had handled disputes and negotiations and collections in Gabriel's name, and he had handled them the way he wanted, not the way Gabriel would have. He had been careful, he had been patient, and he had been above everything else, present, filling the vacuum that Gabriel's deterioration was leaving behind inch by inch, week by week. The chefs had been Deegan's idea, actually, not out of any genuine concern for Gabriel's health, but because a visibly wasting boss was a liability, and because the parade of failed culinary experts gave Deegan a convenient reason to be involved in the household, to have access to be seen as the man keeping things running while Gabriel faded. Every chef who left meant another week of Deegan's control consolidating further. Every failed meal meant Gabriel remained weakened, and a weakened Gabriel meant an absent Gabriel, and an absent Gabriel meant the empire Deegan had spent 6 years orbiting would finally, naturally, inevitably fall into his hands. This was what Deegan Butler was thinking on the morning that Bridget Collins arrived at the Navarro mansion, hauling a second-hand duffel bag and a rolling cart of cleaning supplies up the service entrance steps in the middle of a February drizzle. She had been hired through an agency, not the usual agency the Navarro household used for domestic staff. That one had been tapped out of reliable candidates willing to work under the increasingly tense conditions of the mansion. This was a different agency, a smaller one, and Bridget had been at the top of the available list simply because she had submitted her application 6 weeks earlier and had impeccable references from 3 previous employers, all of whom had written things like extraordinarily reliable and genuinely brightens the environment. And from one elderly woman in Cape May, Bridget Collins is the finest human being I have ever had the pleasure of employing, and I include my own children in that comparison. She was 27 years old, from a small town outside Camden, New Jersey, the second oldest of 5 siblings raised by a grandmother who had believed with absolute conviction that good food was the first language of love, and that a kitchen in use was a home in order. Bridget had learned to cook before she learned to drive. She had spent her teenage years feeding her younger siblings after her grandmother's health declined, improvising meals from whatever was available, stretching ingredients and seasoning and patience across the kind of poverty that doesn't make you bitter. If you're lucky enough to have been raised by someone who taught you how to make something out of nothing and find joy in the doing. She was not a trained chef. She had no formal culinary credentials, no certificates on a wall, no Michelin stars in her past. What she had was a deep and intuitive understanding of food as comfort, as communication, as the simplest and most honest form of care one person could offer another. She was also plus size in a body that she carried with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had long ago decided that other people's opinions about her shape were not her problem to manage. She moved efficiently, spoke directly, and had a laugh that arrived without warning and filled whatever room it entered. None of these qualities had been mentioned in the job listing, which had specified cleaning experience, discretion, and availability for live-in placement. Bridget had all 3. What the job listing had not mentioned was that the man whose house she would be cleaning had not eaten a real meal in a year and a half and was being slowly consumed from the inside out by a terror he could not name to anyone without losing the only thing he had left, which was the appearance of control. Mrs. Hargrove, the head of household, met Bridget at the service entrance. Mrs. Hargrove was 62, silver-haired, and carried herself with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been professionally competent for so long that competence had ceased to bring her any satisfaction whatsoever. She looked Bridget up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who had hired and fired a great many people. "You're the new cleaning placement," she said. It was not a question. Yes, ma'am, Bridget said. Bridget Collins. Nice to meet you. You'll address me as Mrs. Hargrove. You'll be assigned to the East Wing, the common areas on the second floor in the kitchen after the chef's hours are done. You will not enter the third floor without explicit instruction. You will not speak to Mr. Navarro unless spoken to first. You will not discuss anything that occurs in this household with anyone outside it. Is that understood? Understood, Bridget said. Do you have questions? Bridget looked around at the service entrance, the immaculate stone floors, the faint smell of cleaning product, and something else underneath it, something clinical, sterile like a space that had been scrubbed of all traces of actual living. Just one, she said. Which way to the supply closet? Mrs. Hargrove blinked. Most new staff had at least 2 or 3 questions about compensation schedule or the nature of the household. This one had asked about the supply closet. She almost smiled. Almost. Follow me, she said. Bridget had been working in the mansion for 4 days before she saw Gabriel Navarro for the first time. She had heard him, of course. The household operated around his rhythms in the way that planets orbit a star, not because the star demands it, but because the gravitational pull is simply that strong. She had heard his footsteps on the floor above her while she cleaned the second-floor hallway at 6 in the morning. She had heard his voice low and precise through a closed study door on the second day. She had heard Mrs. Hargrove's brisk instructions to the rest of the staff. Sir, Navarro takes his shake at 7. Mr. Navarro does not want the east sitting room disturbed before noon. Mr. Navarro's doctor is arriving at 3. Please ensure the front parlor is presentable. Shake. The word had caught her attention the first time she heard it. She had initially assumed it was a scheduling term, some kind of internal code. Then she had seen the packages in the kitchen pantry. 12 of them stacked neatly on a dedicated shelf. Medical nutrition supplements. The kind that came in sealed single-serving packets and were designed to keep hospitalized patients alive when they could not eat solid food. She had stood in the pantry for a long moment looking at those packages. Then she had gone back to mopping the hallway and not said a word. The first time she actually saw him was on the 4th evening, a Thursday around 8 o'clock. She was finishing the east corridor, and he came around the corner from the direction of his study without warning. He was wearing dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, and he was holding a glass of water. And he stopped when he saw her, the same way she stopped when she saw him. The mutual surprise of 2 people who had not expected to encounter another human being in that particular hallway at that particular moment. Her first thought was that she had not expected him to look like this. She had cleaned the rooms of a powerful man. She had dusted the frames of photographs showing a commanding figure in expensive suits, surrounded by men who looked at him the way soldiers look at generals. She had expected someone who looked the part, someone solid present, occupying space with the easy authority of a person accustomed to being obeyed. Gabriel Navarro was tall, and the bone structure was there, the jaw, the brow, the way he held his head. But everything else had been carved away by whatever the last 18 months had done to him. His cheekbones pushed against the skin of his face, his hands wrapped around the water glass were the hands of someone much older than 53, all tendon and knuckle, the skin sitting loosely over the structure beneath. His eyes were dark and sharp and alert in the way that only happened when a body had been running on adrenaline and anxiety for so long that rest had become a foreign concept. He looked at her the way people look at things they cannot immediately categorize. "You're new," he said, not unfriendly, just stating a fact. "Yes, sir," she said. "Bridget Collins. I started Monday." He looked at the mop in her hand, the bucket beside it, the section of floor she had been working on. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read, something between wariness and simple curiosity, the look of a man who had spent so long surrounded by people who wanted something from him that he had forgotten what it looked like when someone simply didn't. "The East Corridor hasn't been mopped properly in 3 weeks," he said. "Mrs. Hargrove keeps assigning it to rotating staff, and none of them do the baseboards." Bridget looked at the baseboards she had just finished scrubbing. "I did the baseboards," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more careful than that. "I can see that," he said, and then he walked past her down the corridor and disappeared around the corner, and that was that. But she kept thinking about the packages in the pantry. The 6th chef. His name was Marco. He was 36, he had trained in Lyon and cooked for a senator, and 2 professional athletes arrived on Bridget's 5th day and lasted exactly 9 days. She watched him work during the hours she cleaned the kitchen after his prep sessions. He was technically brilliant. His knife work was immaculate. He built sauces the way architects build load-bearing walls with precision and structural logic, and not a single unnecessary element. Everything he produced looked like a photograph from a magazine. She watched him plate a roasted chicken with herb juice and shaved fennel salad on a Tuesday evening. Watched him carry it out and then watched him raise her neuron. 11 minutes later, carrying the full plate untouched, his jaw tight and his eyes carefully blank. He set the plate on the prep counter and stood there for a moment. "He didn't eat?" she asked. She knew she probably shouldn't ask, but she asked anyway. Marco looked at her. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said very quietly, "He never eats. He looks at it. Sometimes he picks up the fork. Tonight, he picked up the fork and held it for maybe 4 minutes and then set it back down and asked me to take it away." He paused. "This is the third time this week. What does he say about it?" "Nothing coherent. He thanked me. He said it looked excellent. He said he wasn't hungry." Marco's voice was controlled, but there was something fraying at the edge of it. "He is hungry. You can see it on his face. He is absolutely starving, and he is sitting there thanking me for a meal he will not let himself touch." Bridget thought about what she had heard from 2 of the other maids during a quiet lunch break, the whispered pieces of information that circulate in any closed household among the people who clean the rooms and never get told the official story. She had heard about October 18 months ago, about the restaurant, about the hospital. "He's afraid," she said. Marco looked at her. "Yes," he said, "he is." "And professionally trained food presented on a beautiful plate that doesn't help with fear," she said not unkindly. "If anything, it probably looks like exactly the kind of thing someone would go to elaborate lengths to make perfect before putting something terrible in it." Marco stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the plate and carried it to the disposal. "I have a family," he said. "I cannot keep doing this." He gave his notice the next morning. That evening, Bridget sat in a small room she had been assigned in the staff quarters and thought about her grandmother's kitchen. The yellow walls, the old gas stove that had a burner that required 3 tries before it caught, the smell of onions and garlic softening in oil, the sound of a wooden spoon scraping the bottom of a heavy pot, the way her grandmother would taste from the spoon and then add a pinch of something and taste again. Not because she was following a recipe, but because she was listening to the food, paying attention to what it needed. "Food isn't about technique, baby," her grandmother had told her once. "Anybody can learn technique. Food is about intention. People can taste intention. They always could." Bridget was not planning to do anything. She was a cleaning staff member. She had been explicitly told she would have kitchen access only after the chef's hours were done, and with Marco gone, there was no chef. The kitchen sat empty past 8 in the evening. That was all. She was not planning anything. But 3 days later, a storm rolled in off Lake Michigan and hit Chicago like a closing fist, and the power flickered twice before holding, and the house was filled with the sound of rain against glass and wind against the old stone walls. And Bridget was in the kitchen doing her end-of-day cleanup, and she opened the refrigerator and looked at what was there. Good beef, carrots, celery, potatoes, garlic, an entire head of it fresh, onions, bay leaves, thyme, all of it stocked and waiting, ordered for a chef who was no longer coming. She closed the refrigerator. She stood at the counter for a very long time. Then she opened it again. She told herself it was not a plan. She told herself she was simply using ingredients that would otherwise go to waste, preparing something for herself, something that happened to be filling the kitchen with a smell that had nothing clinical or architectural about it, nothing designed or constructed or presented, just the ancient and honest smell of beef browning in a hot pan of onions, going soft and sweet in the rendered fat, of stock beginning to pull flavor from bone and vegetable with the slow patience of something that could not be rushed. She told herself she was not thinking about the man on the 3rd floor. She was absolutely thinking about the man on the 3rd floor. She had found the heavy Dutch oven in the cabinet below the island. She had seasoned the beef and let it sear without moving it the way her grandmother had taught her, until the crust formed naturally and released on its own. She had built the base slowly: onion, carrot, celery, garlic, a spoonful of tomato paste cooked until it deepened. She had deglazed with stock and let it come up, then nestled the beef back in and put the lid on and lowered the flame to the barest simmer and let time do the rest. The potatoes, she started separately boiling them until they were tender through, then draining them and putting them back in the hot pot with the flame off, shaking them to roughen the surface, then adding butter. More butter than was strictly necessary, but this was not a dish about restraint. This was a dish about warmth and garlic roasted until it was soft as cream, and she worked it all together until the potatoes were whipped into something that felt like comfort made edible. The kitchen was warm. The storm was loud against the windows. The smell in the room was extraordinary, deep and rich, and layered with the kind of complexity that only comes from patience, from layers built slowly from food that has been given time to become itself. She was plating the stew into a deep bowl, the potatoes mounded beside it when she heard footsteps. Not the brisk footsteps of Mrs. Hargrove, not the measured tread of security. These were different, slower, the footsteps of someone who had been drawn somewhere without fully deciding to go. She did not turn around immediately. The footsteps stopped at the kitchen doorway. She heard his breathing. She heard him not speaking. She continued ladling the broth. She set the bowl on the counter. She picked up a clean spoon and rested it against the rim. And then she turned around and Gabriel Navarro was standing in the doorway of his own kitchen in a dark sweater and socked feet, his hair uncombed, his face carrying the stripped-down expression of a man who had been woken from something not sleep, something deeper than sleep by a smell he had not allowed himself to follow in a very long time. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. "I used your ingredients," she said. "I'll pay for them from my wages if that's—" "What is that?" he said. It was not quite a question. His voice was different than it had been in the corridor. Quieter, less managed. "Beef stew," she said, "with garlic whipped potatoes. My grandmother's recipe. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just food." He looked at the bowl again. Something in his face was working very hard at remaining neutral. She could see the effort of it. "It smells," he started. "I know," she said. A long silence. The storm outside, the low simmer of the pot still on the stove. "Are you going to stand there and stare at it, Sta?" she said carefully. "Or are you going to come in?" He looked at her, then really looked at her, and she held his gaze without moving, without flinching, without performing the careful deference that everyone else in this household aimed at him like a shield. And something in that stillness, in her complete lack of fear or agenda, made him take one slow step into the kitchen, and then another. And then Gabriel Navarro was standing at the counter of his own kitchen, looking down at a bowl of beef stew made by a woman who had been employed to clean his floors for less than 2 weeks, and his hands were at his sides, and his throat was working, and every alarm in his body was firing in every direction at once. "I know what happened to you," she said quietly. "Not cruelly. I've heard enough to understand. And I'm not going to tell you it's fun or it's safe or that you have nothing to worry about. I'm just going to tell you that I made this myself. I used everything from that refrigerator over there. No one touched it but me. And I'm going to eat some right now in front of you from the same pot with the same ladle. And then whatever you decide to do is your decision." She took a clean bowl from the cabinet. She ladled the stew from the pot. She picked up a spoon, and she ate. Not demonstratively, not as a performance. She ate the way she always ate, with the quiet attention of someone who actually loves food, who finds genuine pleasure in the taste of a thing well made, who is present in the act of eating the way some people are present in the act of praying. Gabriel watched her. He watched her for 3 full minutes. Then, without speaking, he picked up the spoon she had placed beside his bowl. He held it. His hand was not entirely steady. "It's all right," she said, not looking at him, spooning another portion for herself. "Take your time." The spoon hovered over the bowl for what felt like a very long time. And then Gabriel Navarro, head of the Navarro crime family, 53 years old, a man who had still survived 3 assassination attempts and built an empire from nothing, and commanded the fear and loyalty of hundreds of dangerous men, that man dipped his spoon into the broth and lifted it to his lips. The moment the flavor hit him, the deep, slow-built beef, the sweetness of the carrots, the herbaceous warmth of the thyme, the richness that only comes from food that has been given time, something happened in his face that he had no way of hiding and no energy left to charm. His eyes closed, just for a second, just long enough. When he opened them, Bridget was looking at the pot on the stove, not at him, giving him that second in the only way she could think to offer it. He took another spoonful, and another. The storm pressed against the windows. The kitchen was warm. Somewhere in the East Wing, a clock ticked toward midnight, and for the first time in 18 months, Gabriel Navarro ate a real meal. He didn't say much while he ate. She didn't require him to. She finished her own bowl rinsed, put it in the rack, and began to quietly tidy the prep area. When he set his spoon down, she turned back to the counter without looking at the bowl, though she had registered peripherally that it was almost empty. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he said. "My grandmother," she said. "South Jersey. She believed that if you fed people right, they'd be okay." Most of the time, she was right. He was quiet for a moment. "Most of the time," he repeated. "She wasn't a magician," Bridget said. "She was just a woman who knew how to make a pot of something and mean it." Another silence. She wiped down the counter. The storm outside had softened, slightly, the rain still steady, but the wind dying back. "You'll be here tomorrow," he said. It was not quite a question. "That's my schedule, yes," she said. He pushed back from the counter and stood. He was steadier than he had looked coming in. Something about the way he held himself had shifted. Some infinitesimal degree of the terrible rigidity had eased. "Good night, Miss Collins," he said. "Good night, Mr. Navarro," she said. He walked back toward the hallway. At the doorway, he stopped with his back to her. "Don't tell anyone about this," he said. "What happened in here tonight?" "I clean floors," she said. "I don't have conversations." He didn't turn around, but she heard something in the pause that followed, something that might, from a different man in a different life, have been the sound of gratitude. Then he was gone. Bridget stood in the kitchen for a long moment after his footsteps faded. She looked at the bowl on the counter, almost empty. She picked it up and held it for a moment, and she thought about her grandmother, and she thought about the look on a man's face when he realizes he is safe enough to taste something. Then she washed the bowl, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She did not know, lying in her narrow staff quarters bed, while the storm finished itself against the Chicago skyline, that 20 feet away, on the other end of the hall, a door had opened quietly, and Deegan Butler had stood in the gap and watched the kitchen light go dark. She did not know that he had been watching the corridor camera feed from his laptop and had seen Gabriel walk to the kitchen and stay there for 40 minutes. She did not know that he was already calculating what this meant, whether it was a problem, whether she was a variable he had not accounted for. She did not know any of this. She was already asleep, dreamless and still, while the city lights shimmered on the wet streets below, and somewhere in the mansion's east wing, Gabriel Navarro lay in his bed with his hands folded on his chest and felt for the first time in a year and a half the simple and extraordinary sensation of being full. The next morning came the way mornings always did in the Navarro mansion, too early, too quiet, and loaded with the particular tension of a house that had learned to hold its breath. Bridget was in the East Corridor at 6:15 with her cart working her way toward the main hall when Mrs. Hargrove appeared at the far end of the passage and walked toward her with the deliberate pace of someone carrying news they haven't decided how to deliver yet. "Mr. Navarro has requested that you report to the kitchen at 7, Mrs. Hargrove said. She stopped 2 feet away and looked at Bridget with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and warning. Not to clean it, he was specific about that. Bridget kept her face neutral. "All right. Do you know why he would make that request?" "I couldn't say, Mrs. Hargrove." The older woman studied her for a long moment. "Whatever happened last night," she said carefully, "be very deliberate about what you do next. This household has a certain equilibrium. Things that disturb that equilibrium tend to have consequences." "I understand," Bridget said. Mrs. Hargrove held her gaze for another second, then nodded once and walked away. Bridget watched her go and then turned back to her cart and stood very still for a moment, her hands resting on the handle, thinking about equilibrium and what it cost to maintain it when the person at the center of it was wasting away. She was in the kitchen at 5 minutes to 7. Gabriel came in at exactly 7, dressed, shaved, more composed than he had been the night before, but carrying the same careful watchfulness in his eyes that she had noticed in the corridor on their first encounter. He looked at the kitchen, at the counter she had cleaned and left clear, at the coffee she had made and set in a clean cup near the stove, and then he looked at her. "Sit down," he said, and then caught himself. "Please." She sat at the kitchen island. He remained standing, which she understood was not rudeness, but habit. Men like Gabriel Navarro did not sit in rooms with people they were still deciding about. "Last night," he said. "Last night," she agreed. "How much do you know about why the chefs have been failing?" He said it flatly, not accusatory, just direct. "Enough," she said. The restaurant, October before last, the hospital. Something moved across his jaw. Who told you? Nobody told me anything directly. I clean this house. People talk around cleaning staff the way they talk around furniture. They forget we have ears. She paused. I'm not going to use what I know against you, Mr. Navarro. I don't have any reason to. He looked at her steadily. Everyone has reasons. I have a job and a paycheck and a room with a decent mattress, she said. That's what I came here for. Nothing else. The silence stretched. He picked up the coffee cup she had set out. She noticed he hesitated just briefly before lifting it to his mouth and drank. He set it back down without any visible reaction to the taste, which she took to mean it was fine, because she doubted this man masked discomfort well when he was alone. Can you cook something now, he said. Something simple, while I watch. She understood immediately what he was asking and what he was not asking. He was not asking for a meal. He was asking to watch the process, to see the hands, to observe the chain of custody from raw ingredient to finished food with his own eyes, because the thing that had broken in him 18 months ago was not his appetite. It was his ability to trust the gap between the kitchen and the plate. Yes, she said, I can do that. She made eggs. Nothing more complex than that, scrambled eggs with a little butter and salt cooked low and slow, the way her grandmother had insisted, stirring constantly so they stayed soft and barely set. She talked while she cooked, not about the food, just talked the way she would talk to anyone she was comfortable around, about the storm the night before, about the way Chicago cold was different from Jersey cold, about how her youngest brother had once convinced her that scrambled eggs needed hot sauce on principle, and she had spent 6 months believing him before she came to her senses. Gabriel stood at the counter and watched every single movement her hands made, not in a threatening way, in the way of a man who was trying to rebuild something inside himself using the only tools currently available, which were his own eyes and whatever remained of his capacity for trust. She plated the eggs. She set them on the counter. Then she picked up a fork, took a portion for herself directly from the plate, and ate it standing at the counter. He watched her. Then he took the fork and he ate. It was not the revelation of the night before. It was smaller than that, quieter. But in some ways it was more significant because the night before had been driven by hunger so extreme it had overridden fear. This morning the hunger was lower. The fear was still there and he ate anyway. That was different. That was a choice. He ate most of it. He left a small portion and she did not comment on that. Same time tomorrow, he said, and left the kitchen. Bridget stood at the counter and released a breath she had been holding for several minutes. By the third morning, the routine had solidified. By the fifth, Gabriel was eating more than he was leaving. By the end of the second week, something had changed in the texture of the household itself, a subtle shift like a barometric pressure change before weather that everyone in the mansion felt, but no one named out loud. Everyone except Deegan Butler, who named it very precisely to himself and did not like the name at all. He had been watching the camera feeds. He had seen Gabriel walk to the kitchen. He had seen the timestamps. He had cross-referenced them with the staff schedules. He had identified Bridget Collins, pulled her agency file, and spent 40 minutes reading through it with the focused attention of a man looking for a lever. What he found was unremarkable on the surface. A cleaning placement, good references, no criminal history, no financial red flags, no obvious connections to any of the families or organizations that routinely competed with or threatened the Navarro operation. She was exactly what she appeared to be on paper. That somehow bothered him more than anything suspicious would have. He called his contact at the agency, a man who owed him several favors of the kind that couldn't be discussed on a recorded line, and asked for everything that wasn't in the official file. The answer came back within 24 hours. Still nothing. She was a 27-year-old woman from South Jersey who cleaned houses and apparently cooked. Deegan sat with that information and turned it over in his mind. Then he went to find Mrs. Hargrove. He found her in the linen room on the second floor, doing the weekly inventory with the methodical focus she applied to every task. He closed the door behind him, which made her set down her clipboard and look at him with the careful neutrality of a woman who had survived 20 years in a household like this by never revealing her hand to anyone. The new maiden, he said. Collins, what's your read on her? Mrs. Hargrove considered her answer with visible deliberation. Competent, reliable, doesn't cause problems. And the kitchen situation. A pause. I'm not certain what you mean. Yes, you are, he said pleasantly. You know everything that happens in this house, Elaine. It's your one genuine talent. So let me ask you again. The kitchen situation, Collins and Mr. Navarro. How long has it been going on and what exactly is happening? Mrs. Hargrove set her clipboard down fully. She cooks for him in the mornings. He watches and then eats. That's all I know. And he's eating, apparently. Deegan was quiet for a moment. His face showed nothing in particular, which was always with him the most dangerous expression. How much is he eating? More each day, she said, and then added despite herself. He looks better, Mr. Butler. His color is better. He sat in on the Tuesday meeting without ending it early for the first time in 4 months. Deegan nodded slowly. Thank you, Elaine, he said. Let's keep this between us. He left the linen room and walked to the east wing and stood at the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the city and did the calculation he had been avoiding. Gabriel recovering meant Gabriel returning. Gabriel returning meant the quiet restructuring of the past 18 months would come under scrutiny. Some of it would hold up, some of it would not. The pieces that would not hold up were the pieces that most benefited Deegan Butler, and he had been careful, but careful was not the same as invisible. In a fully restored Gabriel Navarro would eventually find every single thread. He needed to think about this differently. He needed to think about Bridget Collins differently. She was not an enemy, she was a variable, and variables in his experience could be managed. You simply had to find the right angle. He went to speak to her the following morning. He chose his timing deliberately after the kitchen session, when Gabriel had returned to his study and Bridget was back on her cleaning rotation in the main hall. He came around the corner, looking unhurried, hands in his pockets, with the particular ease of a man who had never needed to appear anything other than comfortable in every room he entered. Miss Collins, he said warmly, I don't think we've been properly introduced. Deegan Butler. I manage operations for Mr. Navarro. Bridget looked at him. She had a clear-eyed, direct way of meeting people's gaze that he had not expected and that he noted immediately. I know who you are, she said. Of course you do. Word gets around in a house this size. He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced, warm, completely trustworthy looking. I wanted to say personally that what you've been doing for Mr. Navarro is remarkable. Genuinely. You've accomplished something that 6 trained professionals couldn't. That takes real skill. I just made eggs, she said. Don't undersell yourself, he said. Mr. Navarro's health affects this entire organization. What you're doing matters to a lot of people. A pause calculated to feel like sincerity. I also want you to know that if you need anything, resources, access, support of any kind, my door is open. You're an important part of this household now. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, which was unusual for him. That's very kind of you, she said. I'll keep that in mind. Please do, he said and moved on. He turned the corner and his smile dissolved. She hadn't taken the offer. But more importantly, she hadn't reacted to it the way most people did, with flattered compliance or visible relief at having a powerful ally. She had just looked at him, measured, careful, unimpressed. He filed that away. Bridget, meanwhile, went back to her cleaning and thought about that conversation with the focus of someone who had grown up around enough charm deployed as a tool to recognize it on contact. Her older brother Marcus had been charming the same way, all warmth and ease on the surface, always wanting something beneath it. She had learned to read the gap between what charming people said and what their eyes were actually doing. And Deegan Butler's eyes, while his mouth had been offering open doors and support, had been doing something else entirely. They had been assessing, measuring, running numbers. She didn't know what numbers. She didn't know what he was calculating. But she knew the calculation was happening, and she knew it was not about her welfare. She said nothing about it to Gabriel. She had no evidence of anything, and she had been in this household for less than 3 weeks. And the last thing she intended to do was introduce suspicion into a situation where she was trying to build trust. But she kept Deegan Butler's face in her mind, the way you keep an unfamiliar sound in your mind when you're walking home at night, not panicked about it, just aware. The morning sessions continued. Gabriel began to linger a little longer after eating. He would lean against the counter while she cleaned up, and he would talk. Not about the business, never that. About other things. About a restaurant in Rome he had visited when he was 30 and had never forgotten. about his mother's Sunday gravy, which he described with the specific detail of someone who had spent years trying and failing to find its equal. About a summer when he was 12 and his family had rented a house somewhere in the South Jersey shore, which made Bridget laugh out loud because her grandmother had taken her to Wildwood that same summer, and the proximity of their parallel childhoods in that single overlapping point on the map produced a moment of genuine surprise in both of them. Wildwood, he said, we were in Stone Harbor. Stone Harbor is very fancy, she said. My uncle owned a house there, and he said, we were not fancy people. We just had an uncle with good real estate instincts. A pause. Are you from the shore originally? No, near Camden, but my grandmother believed in the beach. She said sand was cheap therapy. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile still, but closer than anything she had seen from him yet. She sounds like a formidable woman. She absolutely was, Bridget said. She kept 5 grandchildren in a drafty house and a 30-year-old stove running simultaneously and never once complained about any of it. What happened to her? She died 4 years ago, heart failure. Bridget was quiet for a moment. I still cook like she's going to walk in and tell me I used too much salt. Gabriel was quiet too, and then he said very simply, that's how you know someone really taught you something, when they're still in the room even when they're not. Bridget looked at him. He was looking at the counter, not at her, and his voice had been unguarded in a way she suspected he did not allow very often. And she understood that what he had just said was about more than her grandmother. She did not point this out. She just rinsed the pan and said, same time tomorrow. Same time tomorrow, he confirmed and left. It was on the 18th day that everything shifted. Gabriel walked into the kitchen that morning with an expression she had not seen before. Not the habitual wariness, not the controlled blankness, but something tighter. His jaw was set. His eyes were working over some internal problem with visible intensity. He sat down. He sat, which he had not done since the first morning, which told her immediately that whatever was happening was something he was not standing up for. Something's wrong, she said, not a question. He looked at her. I had a call this morning from a source I trust. There's going to be a sit-down next week, a formal meeting with the Cartuzzo family of the Petrov organization and 3 other parties. He stopped. I haven't attended a formal meeting in 11 months. Deegan has been representing me. And now you need to go yourself, she said. I need to go myself, he said. And I need to... He stopped again. The word he was looking for seemed to be causing him physical difficulty. I need to be present, fully present, not, he gestured at himself at the thinness, at the visible evidence of 18 months of deterioration. Not this. You've been eating for 2.5 weeks, she said. That's not nothing. It's not enough. He looked at her directly. I need to be able to sit at a table with 7 other people and eat a full meal without falling apart. In 6 days. Bridget understood what he was asking. He was not asking her to perform a miracle. He was asking her to help him practice the one thing that still terrified him, eating in company. Eating under observation, eating when the food had not been prepared in front of his eyes, by someone he had begun carefully and incrementally to trust. All right, she said, then that's what we're going to do. She started that evening. She set the kitchen table for 2, something she had not done before the morning. Sessions had always been casual, standing at the counter, and she cooked a full dinner, and she sat across from him, and they ate together. The first time his hands were not entirely steady, and he left a third of the plate. She did not comment. They talked about nothing consequential. She asked him about the Rome restaurant, and he told her about it in detail, the location, the particular pasta dish, the way the light came through the windows, and she asked questions and listened, and kept the conversation moving so that his attention was elsewhere, while his hands lifted the fork and carried food to his mouth, and his body processed the fact that this was safe, this was fine, this could be done. Second evening, he left less on the plate. Third evening, she invited one of the household security staff, a quiet man named Torres, who had been with the Navarro operation for 12 years, and who Gabriel trusted the way you trust furniture implicitly and without conscious thought, to join them for dinner. Gabriel's jaw tightened when Torres sat down, but he did not leave the table. He ate in company for the first time in 18 months. He left a quarter of the plate. Bridget noted the progress without celebrating it out loud because she understood that celebrating it would make Gabriel aware of it as a performance rather than a reality, and the whole point was to make it feel like reality. Fourth evening, Torres again, and this time Gabriel's personal attorney, a compact, serious man named Sal, who had apparently been told nothing about the nature of the dinner and simply showed up, saw the table sat down, and began talking about a contract dispute in the way of a man who treated meals primarily as opportunities to conduct business. Gabriel ate with Sal, talking at him about paperwork for 45 minutes, and finished the entire plate. On the fifth evening, Deegan Butler walked past the kitchen doorway at 7:30 and stopped. The table was set for 4. Gabriel sat at the head of it. Torres and Sal were on one side. Bridget was moving between the stove and the table, setting down dishes, and Gabriel was talking, actually talking, not performing the act of talking, but genuinely engaged, leaning slightly forward, one hand moving to make a point. The color in his face better than it had been in more than a year. His eyes alive with something that had been absent from them for a very long time. Deegan stood in the doorway and took all of this in with a stillness that was entirely different from the stillness of a man at rest. It was the stillness of a man recalculating. 6 days ago, he had estimated he had at least 4 more months, possibly 6, before Gabriel's deterioration reached a point that would require formal action. He had been moving on that timeline. He had meetings scheduled, arrangements and progress positions being quietly consolidated. What he was looking at right now was not 4 months. What he was looking at was a man who was coming back. Gabriel looked up and saw him. "Deegan," he said. His voice was level, easy, the voice of a man who had been expecting this moment and had decided in advance how he was going to play it. "Sit down." Deegan sat. Bridget set a plate in front of him without any particular ceremony, without looking at his face, without any indication that she had spent the last 5 evenings preparing Gabriel for exactly this kind of test. She went back to the stove and the table conversation resumed, and Deegan Butler sat in Gabriel Navarro's kitchen and ate a meal prepared by a 27-year-old woman from Camden, New Jersey, and smiled at everything that was said, and watched Gabriel eat a full plate of food with steady hands and clear eyes. And underneath the smile, he was very, very carefully thinking about his next move. Because the man across the table from him was not the diminished, hollowed version he had been managing around for 18 months. Something had been repaired. Something structural. Something deep. And a repaired Gabriel Navarro Deegan knew with the absolute certainty of someone who had studied this man for 6 years would eventually look at the architecture of his own operation and notice everything that had been moved. The question was not whether Gabriel would find it. The question was how much time Deegan had before he did. He looked at Bridget, who was coming back from the stove with a serving dish, and she glanced at him for just a moment as she set it down. One clean, direct look. No deference, no performance, just eyes that were paying attention, and then she looked away. He kept his expression perfectly pleasant, but he had made his decision. The woman was a problem, not because of what she knew, but because of what she was doing to Gabriel's ability to function, to think, to see. A weakened Gabriel had been manageable. A Gabriel with an anchor, a person who had rebuilt his capacity for trust at the most fundamental level, was something else entirely. She needed to be removed from the equation, cleanly, without drama, without anything that could be traced back or questioned. An agency issue, a background concern, something that would require her to be let go quietly and quickly before the formal sit-down next week. He reached for his fork. "This is excellent," he said to no one in particular. Bridget said thank you without looking at him. And across the table, Gabriel Navarro, who had not missed a single thing that had just passed between them, picked up his glass and drank and said nothing at all. But his eyes had gone somewhere very still and very cold. And Deegan, for all his years of reading people, was looking at his plate when it happened and did not see it. The dinner ended the way good dinners in dangerous houses always end, with everyone saying the right things and nobody meaning all of them. Torres and Sal left first, sliding out with the practiced ease of men who had learned when a room needed thinning. Deegan followed 3 minutes later, unhurried, with a handshake for Gabriel and a pleasant nod toward Bridget that landed just slightly wrong, like a picture hung a half-inch off level. Close enough to pass. Not quite right. Gabriel watched him go. He sat at the table after everyone had cleared out, one hand resting on the edge, the other around his water glass, and he was very quiet in the way he got quiet when something was moving behind his eyes that he had not yet decided to speak out loud. Bridget was clearing the table. She worked without rushing, stacking plates with the efficient economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and she did not press him. She had learned already that Gabriel Navarro did not respond well to being pressed. He was the kind of man who arrived at things on his own timeline, and the best thing you could do was stay in the room and let him get there. He got there faster than she expected. "How long have you known?" he said. She set the stack of plates down on the counter and turned around. "Known what specifically?" That Deegan was a problem. She looked at him for a moment. "I suspected something the morning he came to find me in the hall, about 10 days after I started." She paused. "He was too warm. Men like that aren't warm without a reason." Gabriel's jaw moved. "Men like what?" "Men who are used to being the most important person in every room," she said. "They don't turn on charm for cleaning staff. Not unless the cleaning staff has something they want or is standing between them and something they want." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people whose assessments of the same situation had just confirmed each other. "I need to ask you something," Gabriel said, "and I need you to answer me straight." "I always answer you straight," she said. "Did he approach you with anything concrete, an offer, a request, anything with a specific shape to it?" "No, it was all implication. Open doors, resources available. The kind of thing that doesn't mean anything by itself but is clearly the first move in something." She leaned against the counter. "I didn't take it, and I didn't push back. I just let it land and walked away." Gabriel nodded slowly. "That was the right call." "I know," she said. Another silence. Then he said, "He's going to try to have you removed before the sit-down." She had considered this possibility. She had not let herself dwell on it, but she had considered it. On what grounds? "He'll manufacture something, a background issue, a reference discrepancy, something small and procedural that Mrs. Hargrove would have to act on, regardless of her own judgment." He looked at her directly. "He'll do it in the next 48 hours before I have time to formalize anything about your role here." "And can he do that?" she said. "Have me removed?" "He can try," Gabriel said. "Whether he succeeds depends on whether I move first." The word "first" sat in the room between them for a moment. "What does moving first look like?" she said carefully. "It looks like me making a call tonight and adjusting your employment status in a way that removes it from the agency's jurisdiction entirely. Direct household staff, my payroll, my decision." He paused. "That would make it significantly harder for Deegan to touch your position without coming to me directly, which he won't do because he doesn't want me looking at him closely right now." Bridget was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she was being offered, and she thought about what it Kate, and she thought about her grandmother, who had always said that the most important question about any gift was not what it gave you, but what it asked of you in return. "And what does that mean for me?" she said, concretely. "It means you stay," he said. "It means you're protected within this house. It also means you're more visible, more connected to me specifically, which carries its own risks in a house like this one." "I already cook you breakfast," she said. "I think the visibility ship has sailed." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite the smile still, but it was getting closer every day. "Fair point." "Make the call," she said. He made the call, 11 minutes of brief conversation with someone whose voice she heard only as a low register through the phone, and it was done. She was no longer a placement from Whitmore Staffing Solutions. She was direct Navarro household staff, her contract held by a legal entity that reported exclusively to Gabriel, her position secured by the kind of institutional weight that Deegan Butler could not dismantle without making noise he did not want to make. She went to bed that night knowing that she had just crossed a line she could not uncross, and she lay in the dark for a while thinking about that. And then she thought about the look on Gabriel's face at the table when he had been talking to Sal about the contract dispute, animated and present in himself in a way he clearly had not been for a very long time. And she decided that the line was one she was comfortable having crossed. The next morning, Deegan called the Whitmore agency at 8:15 and was informed in the politely neutral tones of an administrative coordinator who knew nothing about the power dynamics involved that Bridget Collins was no longer a Whitmore placement and that any employment matters relating to her would need to be directed to the Navarro household directly. There was a pause on the line that the coordinator probably interpreted as confusion. It was not confusion. Deegan thanked her, pleasantly ended the call, and sat for 3 minutes without moving. Then he made a different call to a man named Reyes, who handled the kind of problems that did not have official solutions, and he spoke for 4 minutes in careful language that meant something quite different from what the words themselves said. And when he finished, he felt measurably better. Bridget would not need to be removed through bureaucratic channels. There were other channels. What Deegan had not accounted for in this calculation, as in several previous ones, was Torres. Torres was 44 years old, had worked security for Gabriel Navarro since he was 32, and had exactly one loyalty in his life, which was absolute and had been tested several times and had held every single time. He was not a complicated man. He was not a politically minded man. He was the kind of man who noticed things quietly and reported them to one person, and one person only, and that person was Gabriel. Torres had been in the security monitoring room when Deegan's call to Reyes had come through the household communication system, not the external line, which Deegan had been careful to use, but an internal relay that Torres had added 18 months ago, during Gabriel's worst period. A relay that captured signal traffic within a quarter-mile radius of the mansion, because Torres had decided without asking anyone's permission that his boss's safety required it. Torres listened to the 4-minute conversation. Then he went to find Gabriel. He found him in the study at 9:45. He knocked, entered, closed the door, and stood in front of the desk and said with the characteristic economy of a man who did not use more words than a situation required, "Deegan made a call this morning. You need to hear it." He played the recording on his phone held up so Gabriel could hear it clearly. Gabriel listened to all 4 minutes without speaking. His face during those 4 minutes was completely still, in the way that only happened when something had moved from uncertainty to confirmed knowledge, when the thing you had been watching for had finally revealed itself fully, and the only thing left was response. When it ended, he said, "When?" He used language that suggested within the week, Torres said, "before the sit-down." Gabriel nodded once. "Don't do anything yet. Watch Reyes. If he comes within 2 blocks of this house, I want to know immediately." "And Deegan?" "Deegan comes to work this morning, same as always," Gabriel said. "We are not changing anything yet." Torres nodded and left. Gabriel sat at his desk for a long moment. Then he got up and walked to the kitchen, which was where Bridget was at 10 in the morning, having finished her quarter assignments early, and moved to the weekly deep clean of the kitchen appliances. She looked up when he came in. She read his face immediately. What happened? He told her. He told her plainly without softening the language, because she had asked him once to answer her straight, and he had decided that went both directions. He told her about Torres, the recording, the call to Reyes, the timeline. She listened with her hands still on the counter and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something serious, going very quiet, very focused. The warmth not gone, but moved to the back, while the front dealt with what needed dealing with. When he finished, she said, "What is Reyes?" "A man who solves problems," Gabriel said. "What kind of problems?" He looked at her. "The kind you're thinking of." She absorbed this. She was quiet for a moment. "And you're not going to do anything to Deegan yet, because you need more." "I need him at the sit-down," Gabriel said. "I need him in the room performing normal, so the other families don't see any instability in my organization. If I move on him now before the meeting, it creates a vacuum and a question that I cannot afford either of right now." He paused. "After the sit-down, the situation changes. And in the meantime," she said, "in the meantime, you don't go anywhere in this house alone. Torres or one of his people will be in your vicinity at all times. You don't eat or drink anything you haven't prepared yourself. You don't take anything from anyone." He said it with the flat precision of a man reciting operational protocol, and then something shifted, and he said more quietly, "I am not going to let anything happen to you." Bridget looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it meant that this man who had spent 18 months unable to trust the food on his own plate was now standing in his kitchen, telling her with absolute certainty that he would protect her. She thought about what it had cost him to get from there to here, and she thought about her grandmother, who had always said that the truest measure of a person was not what they did when things were easy, but what they held on to when things got hard. "I know," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." The sit-down was in 4 days. 3 days. The house ran on its normal rhythms, on the surface, staff moving through their schedules. Deegan appearing at the expected times in the expected places, his manner unchanged, his smile in good working order. He was good. Bridget would give him that. He was very, very good at performing normalcy while building something underneath it. But she was watching him now with the full attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She saw it on the second day. Lunchtime in the main corridor. She was pushing her cart past the east stairwell, and Dagan was coming down, and there was a man behind him she had not seen before. Not household staff, not one of the regular security rotations. Someone with a visitor pass clipped to his jacket who moved like someone who had been told to move like he belonged there. She kept her pace even. She did not look at the man directly. She looked at the wall past him with the complete incuriosity of someone whose only concern was the baseboards. The man's name she did not know. But she noted the visitor pass number, noted the time, and when she finished the corridor, she went to find Torres. Torres was in the security booth at the end of the East Wing. She told him what she had seen. He looked at the visitor log for that morning. The pass number she had given him matched a name she didn't recognize. A maintenance contractor logged in for HVAC inspection. Torres' face did not change. "We don't have any HVAC work scheduled this week," he said. "I didn't think so," she said. He picked up his radio. The man was located in the West Corridor 20 minutes later, in a section of the house that had nothing to do with HVAC systems and was in fact directly adjacent to the staff quarters wing where Bridget's room was located. He was escorted from the building by two of Torres's people without incident. Dagan was in a meeting with Gabriel's attorney at the time and had a perfect alibi for the entire episode. That evening, Torres played Gabriel the footage. Gabriel watched it twice, his face doing the same thing it had done with the phone recording, going completely still processing, arriving at certainty. "Move the timeline," Gabriel said. "He doesn't wait for after the sit-down. He moves before." He looked at Torres. "Find out everything about Reyes in the next 12 hours. Everything. And I want 2 people on Bridget every moment she's not in a room I'm in personally." Torres left. Gabriel turned to Bridget, who had been standing at the door while he watched the footage, and said, "I owe you an apology." She frowned. "For what?" "For bringing you into this without knowing I was bringing you into this," he said. "You came here to clean floors. You didn't sign up for Deegan Butler." "Nobody signs up for Deegan Butler," she said. "He just shows up." Still, Gabriel. She used his first name for the first time, and it stopped him mid-sentence the way she had intended it to. "I'm not a child, and I'm not a civilian, and I'm standing here with full information and full choice. So stop apologizing and tell me what you need me to do." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved in a way she had not seen before, not the careful, almost smile, not the managed neutrality, but something rawer and more direct. The expression of a man who is genuinely surprised to find himself looked at this way and is not entirely sure how to carry it. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said. "Keep cooking. Keep the routine completely normal. If Deegan sees the routine change, he'll know we've moved and he'll accelerate." "And the sit down," she said. "You're still going." "I'm still going." "Then I need to know what you're going to be eating at that table," she said. And he blinked, and she said, "I'm not being flippant. Seriously, if we have 3 days, I want to run through every dish that's likely to be served at a formal dinner with 7 crime families in the room, and I want you eating it at this table in company under pressure until it is not a performance anymore. Can you give me 3 evenings?" He stared at her. "You want to rehearse the dinner. I want you to walk into that room and eat like a man who has been eating every day of his life," she said. "Because you have been for 3 weeks, and you need to know that in your body, not just your head." Another long moment. And then Gabriel Navarro, who had not really laughed in 18 months, made a sound that was not quite laughter, but was unmistakably adjacent to it. Brief, quiet, real. 3 evenings, he said. "Fine." The rehearsal dinners were something Bridget had not entirely anticipated in terms of what they would become. She had planned them functionally replicate the kind of formal meal the sit-down would involve, add social pressure, incrementally build Gabriel's muscle memory. She recruited Torres Sal, Mrs. Hargrove, and on the 3rd night at Gabriel's specific request, 2 of his captains, who were trusted absolutely and had been told only that Gabriel wanted them to dinner, nothing more. The food was formal, multiple courses, properly plated, the kind of meal that Marco, with all his training and precision, might have produced in this very kitchen, except that Bridget produced it with an additional quality than that Marco's technically perfect plates had always lacked, which was the quality of food made by someone who genuinely wanted the person eating it to feel cared for. Gabriel ate all 3 evenings, every course. He was not flawless on the first evening. His hand shook slightly, reaching for the wine glass, and on the second he went very quiet for about 4 minutes in the middle of the main course, in a way that the others politely did not acknowledge. But he ate, he finished. He sat at the table, and he was present, and he was himself, and by the third evening, with his two captains, talking across the table, and Bridget moving between kitchen and dining room with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years, he looked like the man in the photograph she had dusted on her first week. He looked like Gabriel Navarro. After the captains left on the third night, he stayed at the table while she cleared, and he said quietly, "I want to tell you something." She stopped and looked at him. "6 weeks ago," he said, "Dr. Ellison told me I was approaching a threshold. That was the word he used, threshold." He looked at the table. "I told him something would change. I said it to get him out of the room. I did not believe it." She waited. "I believe it now," he said. He looked up at her. "That's because of you. Specifically, not the food, not the routine, not the logistics of it. You, the way you treated the whole thing as normal. Like it was simply the next thing that needed doing, and of course you were going to do it." He paused. "Nobody has treated me like a normal problem in a very long time." Bridget stood with a serving dish in her hands and felt something move in her chest that she did not try to name because naming it would require her to look at it directly, and she was not quite ready for that. "You are a normal problem," she said. "A man who needed to eat and was scared to. That's all it was." "That is not all it was," he said. The room was very quiet. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose it wasn't. The sit-down was tomorrow morning. Tonight the house was tense in the way it got tense before significant things, the staff moving quietly, security doubled on the perimeter, the particular hallowed breath quality of a household preparing to present its best face to the world. Deegan had been in and out all day, phone pressed to his ear, moving through his routines with the fluid efficiency of a man who was running 2 parallel operations and keeping them from touching each other. He had smiled at Bridget twice in the hallway. She had smiled back both times. Neither smile meant anything close to what it appeared to mean. At 9 that evening, Torres came to Gabriel's study and stood in the doorway and said 2 words. "Reyes moved." Gabriel looked up from the papers on his desk. "He was picked up at the perimeter 20 minutes ago," Torres said. "Armed. He had a photo." A pause. "Of who?" Gabriel said, even though he already knew. "Miss Collins," Torres said. The room went very still. Gabriel stood up from the desk, slowly, the way a man stands when he has made a decision, and the making of it has settled something inside him into a cold and absolute quiet. "Where is she now?" he said. "Kitchen," Torres said. "2 of mine are with her." "Bring Reyes inside," Gabriel said, quietly. "Nobody else in the house knows. And find Deegan. I want to know where Deegan is every single minute for the rest of tonight." Torres nodded. "And Torres," Gabriel said. The man stopped. "Tell her. Don't keep it from her. She has a right to know." Torres looked at him for a second, something passing briefly across his carefully neutral face, and then he nodded again and went. Gabriel stood behind his desk in the silence of his study and looked at the wall and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear, not the paralyzed dread of 18 months of poisoned instincts and shattered trust, but something clean and hard and clarifying. He felt for the first time since October 18 months ago like himself. Deegan had miscalculated. He had looked at Gabriel's recovery and seen a threat to be neutralized, and in doing so, he had made the oldest mistake available to intelligent, patient, ambitious men, which was to move when they were still thinking about the target and had stopped thinking about the man behind the target. Gabriel had not stopped thinking. He had just needed time to be able to think clearly again. And Bridget Collins, with her grandmother's recipes and her complete absence of performance and her steady, unimpressed, caring presence in his kitchen every morning for 6 weeks, had given him that time. He owed her more than he currently had words for. He would find the words after tonight. He picked up the phone and made 3 calls in quick succession. His attorney, one of his captains, and a man 2 levels above Reyes in a chain of connections that he had not needed to activate in over a year. The calls were brief. The language was precise. What was set in motion was not reversible. By midnight, Deegan Butler's carefully constructed alternative future had acquired a fatal crack that would by morning have spread to every wall. But Gabriel did not know that yet when he put the phone down and walked out of his study and down the corridor toward the kitchen, because there was something he needed to do before any of the rest of it, something that was not about strategy or retaliation or the machinery of consequence. He pushed open the kitchen door. Bridget was standing at the counter, both hands flat on the surface, Torres' two men visible in the background. She had clearly been told. Her face was composed in the way a person's face gets composed when they have processed something frightening and decided not to let it own them, but her hands on the counter were pressing hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. She looked at him when he came in. She did not say anything. He crossed the kitchen, and he stood on the other side of the island from her, and he said, "You're safe. Reyes is in custody. You are not leaving this house tonight, and you are not alone for a single minute." She nodded. Her hands on the counter did not relax. "Bridget," he said, and something in the way he said it, the weight he put into it, the fullness of it, made her look up at him with an expression that was no longer composed, that was just her, just a 27-year-old woman from South Jersey who had come to clean floors and had ended up somewhere she could not have mapped at the start. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice was steady, mostly. "I know you are," he said. "You are the most okay person in this house. That is not in question." And for the first time in the 6 weeks she had been standing in his kitchen, Gabriel Navarro reached across the counter and put his hand over hers. It was brief. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. He did not make anything of it, and neither did she. But the pressure of it, warm, deliberate, the grip of a man who meant the thing he was doing, reached something in her that the evening's fear had been pressing hard against, and she exhaled finally a full breath, and her hands under his stopped pressing quite so hard into the counter. "Same time tomorrow," she said, "after the sit-down." "Same time tomorrow," he said. He took his hand back. She turned to the stove. The two security men in the background looked carefully at nothing in particular. And in the east wing of the mansion, in an office with the door locked, Deegan Butler picked up his phone to call Reyes and listened to it ring and ring and ring with no answer. And the first cold thread of understanding began to work its way through his certainty, and for the first time in 6 years of patient, methodical, perfectly calculated waiting, Deegan Butler felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt afraid. Oh, I know. Deegan did not sleep that night. He sat in his office until 2 in the morning redialing a number that would not be answered, and at some point the silence on the other end of that line stopped feeling like a technical problem and started feeling like an answer. He put the phone down and sat with that answer for a long time, turning it over, examining it from every angle, the way a jeweler examines a stone for flaws, and the flaw he found was the same one every time he looked. Reyes was gone, which meant Gabriel had moved first, which meant Gabriel knew, which meant the timeline Deegan had been operating on for the past 6 years had just collapsed to zero. He was still sitting there when the sun came up. By 6 in the morning, he had rebuilt his thinking into something workable. Not a retreat. He did not retreat, had never retreated. That was not how he was constructed, but a reorientation. Gabriel knowing about Reyes was not the same as Gabriel having proof of everything. Reyes was a contractor, a degree of separation deliberately installed. What Gabriel had was a man with a photo. What he could prove from that photo was limited if Deegan was careful, if he controlled the next 12 hours. If he walked into the sit-down this morning as the underboss of a functioning empire and held that position with the same composure he had maintained for 6 years. He showered, dressed, and came downstairs at 7:15, looking like a man who had slept 8 hours and was looking forward to a productive day. He was very good at this. He had always been very good at this. The kitchen was occupied. Gabriel was already at the island, actually sitting, both hands around a coffee cup with the ease of a man fully at home in his own space, while Bridget moved at the stove with the focused quiet of someone in the middle of something that required attention. The smell in the room was eggs and something savory, coffee strong and fresh. Torres stood near the doorway to the back hall with his arms crossed and his eyes moving. Deegan took all of this in without pausing in the doorway. "Hey, morning," he said, walking in and heading for the coffee. "Big day." "Morning, Deegan," Gabriel said. His voice was level, easy, the voice of a man having a normal morning, and Deegan felt the first real chill of something he did not want to identify as fear. He poured his coffee and turned and leaned against the counter and looked at Bridget, who was plating food and had not looked at him. "Something smells outstanding," he said. Thank you, she said without looking up. He watched her hands for a moment. She moved with the same unhurried confidence she always moved with, and she did not give him anything. Not a flicker of what she knew. Not a tightening, not a tell. He filed that away. She was better at this than he had given her credit for. Gabriel ate breakfast. Dagan drank his coffee. The conversation was professional, focused on the sit-down, who would be in the room, the order of business. Two outstanding issues from the Cartuso side that Dagan had been managing, a question about jurisdiction on the south side that needed to be navigated carefully. Gabriel asked precise questions and absorbed the answers and offered his own positions on two of the issues with a clarity and authority that Dagan had not heard from him in more than a year. Each of those positions landed in Dagan's chest like a small cold stone. "I'll handle the opening statement," Gabriel said. "You take the Cartuso secondary agenda. Walk them through the numbers we discussed last week." "Of course," Dagan said. "Whatever you need." "That's all I need from you this morning," Gabriel said, setting down his fork. "We leave at 9. Dagan left the kitchen. His coffee was barely touched. In the hallway, he stopped out of sight of the kitchen and pressed his back against the wall for exactly 3 seconds. Then he straightened, adjusted his jacket, and walked to his office. He needed to make one call before they left for the sit-down. One call that had nothing to do with Reyes or what was already in motion. A call to a different kind of insurance, the kind he had been maintaining at the edges of his planning for 2 years without ever expecting to need it this quickly. A man inside the Cartuso organization who owed Dagan a significant debt and had certain information that, if introduced correctly at this morning's meeting, would raise enough questions about Gabriel's fitness to lead that the assembled families might request a formal review of Navarro leadership. It was not the plan Dagan had wanted. It was messier, more public, harder to control. But it was what the morning had given him, and he had always been able to work with what the morning gave him. He made the call in 4 minutes, speaking quietly, precisely giving the man inside the Cartuso organization exactly what he needed and when to use it. He ended the call, straightened his cuffs, and picked up his briefcase. Torres was in the hallway when he came out of the office, standing still, arms at his sides, looking at nothing in particular. Dagan nodded at him and walked past. Torres waited until he was around the corner, then lifted his radio. He had been in the hallway because Gabriel had asked him to be in the hallway. The listening device that Torres had placed in Dagan's office 3 days ago, sewn into the lining of the spare jacket hanging on Dagan's door hook, had done exactly what Torres had built it to do. He found Gabriel in the study at 8:20. He played the recording. Both of them listened. When it ended, Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. "The Cartuso plant," he said. "Do you know who?" "I have a strong suspicion," Torres said. "A man named Ferretti. He's been on the fringe of their operation for 3 years. Dagan has made 3 financial transfers to an account I traced to Ferretti's wife's maiden name over the past 14 months. Gabriel looked at him. "You've been building this file?" "Yes." "How long?" "Since January," Torres said. 7 months ago, I noticed the first irregular transfer. I didn't bring it to you because you were—" He stopped. He was not a man who chose his words carelessly, and he was choosing these with particular care. "I didn't bring it to you because the timing wasn't right." Gabriel understood what Torres was not saying, which was that 7 months ago, Gabriel had been so deep in the paralysis of his fear that he would not have been able to act on the information. Torres had waited and built the file and waited some more, and this was the loyalty that had nothing to do with fear or money, but with a long-term, undemonstrative, absolute commitment that Gabriel felt now like something physical in his chest. "Thank you," he said. It was not a word he used carelessly either. "What do you want to do about Ferretti?" Torres said. "Nothing before the meeting," Gabriel said. "I want Dagan to play his hand fully. I want everything on the table where I can see it." He stood. "Have the full file, everything on Dagan, the transfers, the Reyes connection, the surveillance reconstruction delivered to Sal's office by 10. And I want a sealed copy sent to my attorney with instructions to open it if anything happens to me today." Torres nodded. "And Bridget?" "She stays here," Gabriel said. "2 of your people with her. She doesn't go anywhere until I'm back." He went to the kitchen to tell her himself. She was cleaning the post-breakfast prep area, moving through the work with the steady rhythm he had come to understand was what she looked like when she was thinking. She turned when he came in and read his face and said, "You know something new." "I know most of it," he said. "Enough." He told her about the call Torres had recorded about Ferretti, about the plan to surface questions about his fitness at the meeting. He told her plainly because she had asked him once to answer her straight, and he had decided this was non-negotiable between them. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He's going to try to take you down in front of everyone." "He's going to try," Gabriel said. "He will not succeed." "How can you be sure?" "Because I have everything," he said, "and he doesn't know I have it." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her face that was not quite fear for herself and not quite fear for him, and was probably some specific combination of both that she was managing with the same focused competence she applied to everything else. "Be careful," she said. "I am always careful," he said. "No," she said. "You've been surviving. That's different from careful. I mean, actually careful. Pay attention to every person in that room and don't let him make you feel like you have something to prove, because you don't." He looked at her. The thing that happened in his face when she looked at him directly had been happening with increasing frequency and with decreasing ability to be attributed to anything simple. He had stopped trying to attribute it to anything simple. "I'll be back by 2, he said. "I'll have lunch ready," she said. He almost smiled. This time it was very close to the real thing. Then he turned and went. The sit-down was held in a private room in a downtown hotel that 3 of the 5 families used for this purpose because it had been vetted 6 ways, had no recording capability that any of them had been able to find, and had a kitchen that could be locked down for the duration with trusted staff. 7 men sat around the table, plus Gabriel and Deegan, making 9 total. Gabriel sat at his customary position. Deegan sat to his left. The first 40 minutes were procedural. Territory confirmations, revenue acknowledgments, 2 minor disputes that were resolved without significant friction. Gabriel spoke when he spoke, listened when he listened, and the men around the table responded to him the way they had always responded, with the particular attention given to someone whose position at the table is not in question. Deegan watched this and recalibrated very slightly the timing of what he had arranged with Ferretti. He had planned for it to land during the opening phase when Gabriel was still finding his footing. But Gabriel had found his footing immediately and completely, and introducing a challenge now would look less like a reasonable concern and more like a coordinated strike, which was what it was, and which needed to not look like what it was. He moved the timing. He would wait for the financial review portion, which was coming up when the numbers on the south side were going to surface naturally. That was the right moment. Gabriel's extended absence had created gaps in those numbers that Deegan himself had managed, and the way Deegan had managed them was not the way Gabriel would have managed them. And in the right framing with Ferretti's voice, adding weight at the right moment, that gap could be made to look like evidence of a leadership crisis rather than evidence of deliberate manipulation. It was a good plan. It had always been a good plan. The only variable was that Gabriel needed to be caught slightly off balance to make it land. And Gabriel, sitting at the head of that table this morning, did not look like a man who could be caught off balance. He looked like a man who had already seen everything coming. Deegan pushed the thought away. He was projecting. Gabriel did not know about Ferretti. The call had been clean. The financial review began at 10:40. Gabriel presented the Navarro numbers with Sal's documentation, precise and comprehensive, and the room received them without objection. Then the south side question came up naturally, exactly as Deegan had anticipated, surfaced by one of the Cartuso representatives who had a legitimate interest in the jurisdictional question. And Ferretti, who was seated 2 positions to Gabriel's right in his capacity as a secondary Cartuso representative, cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, "there's a concern that's been circulating on our side of the table, relating specifically to the management of the Navarro South Corridor over the past year. There are some inconsistencies in the numbers that suggest the organization may have been operating without adequate central oversight." The room shifted. Not dramatically, these were men trained to receive information without visible reaction, but the quality of attention in the room changed in a way that was palpable. Deegan kept his face perfectly still and waited for what came next. This was the moment. Ferretti would surface the specific numbers, frame them as a leadership gap, and the assembled families would begin asking questions that Gabriel, however recovered, could not answer without revealing the extent of his incapacitation over the past 18 months. Gabriel said which inconsistencies. Ferretti named 3 specific line items, numbers that Deegan had moved carefully and gradually over the course of 11 months. Gabriel said, "I'm familiar with all 3 of those adjustments. They were authorized specifically because of a cash flow restructuring I initiated in the spring of last year. He opened the folder in front of him. Sal, the supporting documentation. Sal, sitting 2 seats to Gabriel's right, slid 3 sheets across the table. Deegan stared at the sheets. He had never seen those documents before. He had moved those numbers in a way that he had been certain left no paper trail connecting them to authorization from Gabriel, because Gabriel had not authorized them. Gabriel had not been capable of authorizing anything substantive for most of last year. The documentation sitting on that table did not exist in any filing system Deegan had access to, which meant it had been created by someone who knew the exact numbers to cover and had worked backward from Deegan's own movements to build a paper trail that looked legitimate. His face showed nothing. He was very proud of the fact that his face showed nothing. Gabriel said, "The inconsistencies your team identified were the result of an internal restructuring strategy. I appreciate the due diligence." He looked at Ferretti with the quiet, settled authority of a man who has just watched someone else's chess piece come off the board. "Is there anything else from your side?" Ferretti said there was not. Deegan reached for his water glass and drank and set it down and did the internal calculation with the speed and precision of a man who had always been excellent under pressure. The documents were fabricated. Gabriel had known about Ferretti before the meeting, which meant he had known about the call to Ferretti this morning, which meant Torres had heard the call, which meant Torres had a device in Deegan's office, which meant everything Deegan had believed about his operational security in that house was wrong. He sat with all of this for approximately 4 seconds. Then he made his decision. He was not going to be handled quietly. He was not going to be walked out of a room on someone else's terms. If Gabriel wanted to end this, it was going to be in the open, right now at this table, where the assembled families were witnesses and where Deegan still had 6 years of relationships and operational knowledge that carried weight regardless of what Gabriel knew or didn't know. He put both hands on the table and said, "Gabriel, I think we need to have a different conversation." The room went very still. Gabriel looked at him. "Do we?" he said. "I think some things need to be said directly," Deegan said. He kept his voice level, almost collegial, the voice of a man raising a reasonable concern. "There are people in this room who have been uncertain over the past year and a half about the stability of the Navarro leadership. That uncertainty has affected relationships, decisions, the willingness of certain parties to commit to agreements. That's just reality, and I think the honest thing, the respectful thing to the people at this table is to acknowledge it rather than paper over it." A very long silence. The men around the table were watching this with the focused attention of people who understood that they were witnessing something significant and needed to assess it correctly. Gabriel said, "I agree." Deegan blinked. He had not expected agreement. "I think honesty is exactly what this table needs this morning," Gabriel said. "So let's be honest." He opened the folder again. Torres. The door at the back of the room opened. Torres came in, and behind him was Sal, carrying a second file that was considerably thicker than the first. Torres set something on the table, a small recording device, the kind that fit in a jacket lining, and stepped back. Gabriel said, "Over the past 7 months, my head of security has documented 31 irregular financial transfers from Navarro operational accounts to 3 shell entities. The total is approximately $4.2 million. The transfers correlate precisely with periods when my physical availability was limited and Deegan was managing accounts on my behalf." He looked around the table. "I have the complete documentation, the account tracing, and records of Deegan's communications with a contractor named Reyes, who was taken into custody last night in possession of a photograph of a member of my household staff. A photograph consistent with preparation for a targeted action." The room was not just still now, it was frozen. Gabriel looked at Deegan. "You asked for honesty," he said. "That's what I have." Deegan sat with everything collapsing around him and held on to his composure by the sheer force of 6 years of practice. And then he did the only thing left available to him, which was to look Gabriel in the eye and say with a steadiness he would later consider his finest performance, "Whatever you think you have, Gabriel, you should consider very carefully whether this is the right room to—" "It is exactly the right room," Gabriel said quietly. "These men have been operating under uncertainty about my organization for 18 months. They deserve to know that the uncertainty was manufactured, that the instability they observed was not mine. It was yours." He paused. "You built a very patient architecture, Deegan. I'll give you that. 7 months before I took my first real look at it, and 4 more months to put it all together. You almost had enough time. Deegan looked at him. For a moment, just a moment, the composure cracked, and what was underneath it was something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was the specific expression of a man who has watched a certain future disappear and cannot yet locate another one. The maid, he said, his voice was flat. The fat maid from Jersey, that's what changed the timeline. Several things happened at once. Gabriel's expression went somewhere cold and absolute. Torres took one step forward, and the man to Deegan's left, representing the Petrov organization, moved his chair slightly away from him with the deliberate casualness of someone establishing a position. Gabriel said, "Escort him out." 2 men came from outside the door. Deegan stood without being touched because he was still to the end, a man who chose how he moved and was not moved for him. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Gabriel. He was going to say something. You could see it, the shape of a last word forming. Then he looked at the faces around the table, at the men who had, until this morning, considered him a credible figure in this world, and he saw in their expressions not hatred or contempt, but something worse, which was the removal of consideration, the taking away of account, and the dismissal that in this world was more final than almost anything else. He left without speaking. The door closed. Gabriel sat at the head of the table in the silence that followed and breathed one long breath, and then he looked around at the assembled men and said, "I apologize for the disruption. If there's remaining business, I'd like to address it now." There was remaining business. They addressed it. 2 more hours productive and focused, and when it was done, the men around the table spoke to Gabriel with a directness and engagement that had been absent from their dealings with him for a year and a half. Not warmth exactly. This was not a room for warmth, but the particular quality of attention that powerful people give to other powerful people they believe are fully present and fully in control. Gabriel was in the car by 1:15. Torres drove. Neither of them said anything for the first 10 minutes. Then Torres said, "The documents Sal presented, the authorization trail." "Yes," Gabriel said. "I didn't build those," Torres said. "No," Gabriel said. "You didn't." A pause. "Sal." "No," Gabriel said. He was looking out the window. "I built them 3 nights ago, after you brought me the first recording." He paused. "I have 18 months of transactions memorized. Every number Deegan moved, I knew where it came from and where it went. Building the paper trail took about 4 hours. Torres was quiet for a moment. "Those documents were fabricated." "They were accurate," Gabriel said. "The money moved the way I said it moved. I simply created the authorization record that Deegan had deliberately prevented from existing." A pause. "Don't ask me about the legal architecture of that." Torres said nothing. He was, as always, not a complicated man, and his assessment of the situation was simple and did not require legal analysis. The car moved through the city. "She's going to have lunch ready," Gabriel said, not quite to Torres, not quite to himself. "She said she would," Torres confirmed. "She always does what she says she will," Gabriel said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, quiet, settled, the voice of a man acknowledging something true about the world that he had not been certain was still true about the world until very recently. He was in the door at 1:58. He had said 2. He was as he had always been before October 18 months ago, a man who was where he said he would be when he said he would be there. Bridget was in the kitchen. The table was set for 2. The smell in the room reached him before he was fully through the door. Something warm and deep and familiar. Not fancy, not elaborate, just honest food made with honest hands. She turned from the stove when she heard him come in. She looked at his face and she read what was there. Not relief exactly, but the expression of a man who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just been allowed to set it down. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She turned back to the stove. "Sit down. Food's ready." He sat. She brought 2 plates and set one in front of him and sat across the table with her own, and he looked at the plate for a moment. Braised chicken, roasted carrots, potatoes with herbs, and picked up his fork without hesitation, without the old pause, without any of the internal negotiation that had once made the simple act of eating feel like combat. He just picked up the fork and ate. They were quiet for a while. Not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of 2 people who had been through something significant together and did not yet need to put language around all of it. Then Bridget said, He said something when they were taking him out. Gabriel looked at her. Torres had told her. Of course Torres had told her. He did, Gabriel said. The fat maid from Jersey, she said. She said it evenly the way she said most things without performance. Gabriel set his fork down. He looked at her across the table with an expression that had moved entirely past the managed neutrality and the careful, almost smiles that was just his face unguarded, saying what it was saying. He meant it as an insult, he said. He was identifying the thing that broke his plan. He wasn't wrong about what it was. He was only wrong about the word. Bridget looked at him. You were the thing that changed the timeline, he said. Not my lawyers, not Torres, not the documentation, you. Because you walked into this house and you treated the most important problem like a normal one and you made me functional again, and a functional me was the only thing standing between Deegan Butler and everything I spent 30 years building. He paused. That's not nothing. That's not a small thing. I want you to understand that. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were on the table and she was looking at him with the same direct, steady attention that she had turned on him from the very first morning. And she said, I know what I did. I just made food for a man who needed to eat. Yes, he said, and you have no idea how much that was. Outside, the city moved through its afternoon, and in the Navarro mansion, the kitchen was warm, and the food was good, and Gabriel Navarro ate every bite on his plate and did not once look at the door. The week after the sit-down was the quietest the Navarro mansion had been in 18 months. Not the brittle quiet of a house holding its breath, but something different. The quiet of a space that had been under pressure for so long that the sudden release of it took time to settle into the walls. Staff moved through their routines with a looseness that had not been there before. Conversations happened in hallways that would previously have been conducted in whispers behind closed doors. Even Mrs. Hargrove, who had maintained the same carefully neutral expression through every crisis and every chef and every failed dinner for a year and a half, was spotted by two different maids on Tuesday morning doing something that they both later described with some uncertainty as humming. Gabriel noticed all of it. He noticed the way a man notices things when he has come back into full possession of his own attention completely, and with a kind of quiet gratitude for the noticing itself. He also noticed Bridget. This was not new. He had been noticing Bridget since the first morning in the kitchen when she had eaten eggs in front of him without making a performance of it, and waited without any impatience for him to do the same. But the noticing had changed in character over the weeks, had moved from the watchful assessment of a man rebuilding his capacity for trust to something that did not have a clean operational category, and that he had been, with the same careful discipline, he applied to everything not examining too directly. The discipline was getting harder to maintain. On Wednesday, 3 days after the sit-down, Dr. Ellison came for his scheduled visit. He had been coming every 2 weeks for 18 months, arriving with his charts and his carefully managed concern and his verdict of deterioration delivered in the language of clinical precision, because clinical precision was the only distance he had left from something that was genuinely frightening him. He came in on Wednesday morning and stood in the doorway of the sitting room where Gabriel was waiting, and he stopped. He looked at Gabriel for a long moment without speaking. Then he crossed the room and stood in front of him and did what doctors do, asked questions and took readings and reviewed the numbers his equipment produced, and the numbers were different from the numbers 2 weeks ago. Substantially different in every direction that mattered. And when he was done, he sat across from Gabriel with his charts in his lap, and he said, with a directness he had not been able to use in a very long time, "What happened?" "I started eating," Gabriel said. Dr. Ellison looked at him. "Gabriel, I've been telling you to start eating for 18 months. "I know," Gabriel said. "I brought in a nutritional specialist, 3 of them." "I know. I recommended 6 different therapists who specialize in trauma-related food aversion." "I know that too," Gabriel said. "None of it was what I needed." Dr. Ellison sat with that for a moment. "What did you need?" "Someone who didn't treat it like a medical problem," Gabriel said. "Someone who treated it like dinner." The doctor was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, "I see." He made a note. He looked up. "Your weight is still below optimal. We have work to do, but the trajectory has reversed and your organ function has improved significantly. I need you to maintain this consistently." He paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Gabriel said, and the certainty in his voice was not the certainty of a man saying what a doctor wants to hear. It was the certainty of a man who has an anchor and knows it. Dr. Ellison left at noon. At 12:15, Gabriel went to the kitchen. Bridget was at the stove. She was making something that involved a stock she had clearly been building since morning, the kind of long, simmered thing that required patience and could not be rushed. She turned when he came in. "How did it go?" she said. "He used the word trajectory," Gabriel said. "Apparently mine has reversed." She looked at him. "Apparently." He sat at the island and watched her work and said, "I want to talk to you about something." "You're going to talk to me whether I say yes or no to that," she said. "So go ahead." Something moved through his chest at that, the ease of it, the way she had never once adjusted her directness to accommodate his position, had never performed deference or softened her edges because of who he was. He had spent 30 years surrounded by people who shaped themselves to his moods and preferences, who anticipated and accommodated and never once just talked to him like a person talking to another person. "I want to formalize your role in this household," he said. She kept her eyes on the pot. "What does that mean?" "It means you are not cleaning staff. You have not been cleaning staff in any functional sense since the first morning I asked you to come to the kitchen. I want your position to reflect what you actually are." "And what am I actually?" she said. She said it without coyness, just directly, the question meaning exactly what it appeared to mean. "My personal chef," he said. He paused. He was not a man who paused often, and the pause was visible. "The person who runs this kitchen, and by extension this household, in the way that actually matters. Not the administrative management that's Mrs. Hargrove's domain, and she does it better than anyone, but the living part. The part that makes this a place people want to be in instead of a fortress they're assigned to." Another pause, shorter. "I don't have the right word for what that is." Bridget was quiet for a moment. She stirred the pot. She did not use the pause to deflect or to fill the space with something easy. "A title doesn't change what I do," she said finally. "No," he said, "but it changes what other people understand about what you do, and it changes your compensation, which has been incorrect since approximately your third day here." She looked at him, then fully over her shoulder. "How incorrect?" "Samahan." "Significantly," he said. She turned back to the pot. I know you don't need it," he said. "I know exactly what you need and don't need, and you have a consistent habit of understating the former and dismissing the latter. I'm not asking you to need it. I'm telling you it's right, and I would like to do what is right." A long pause. The stock simmered. Outside, a car moved on the street below. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "But I want to keep doing the East Corridor baseboards," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove's rotation still doesn't do them properly." He stared at her back for a moment, and then Gabriel Navarro laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind of sound that had apparently been absent from this particular kitchen for long enough that it made the two security men in the back hallway look at each other with an expression that was not confusion exactly, but was definitely surprise. Bridget smiled at the pot. She did not turn around. She let him have the moment without turning it into something he would need to manage. The laugh faded and he said, "The East Corridor baseboards are yours if you want them." "Thank you," she said seriously and added something to the stock. The formalization happened on Thursday. Sal drew up the paperwork. Mrs. Hargrove was informed, and her response a single slow nod followed by the observation that this arrangement should have been clarified 2 weeks ago was the closest thing to approval that anyone in the mansion had ever extracted from her on a personnel matter. Bridget signed the papers at the kitchen table after breakfast, with Gabriel standing at the counter drinking coffee and watching her in the way he watched things he wanted to remember clearly. "Don't read all of it right now," he said. "Sal will walk you through the specifics." "I'm going to read all of it," she said without looking up. "Of course you are," he said. She read all of it. It took 20 minutes. She had 2 questions for Sal, both precise and relevant, and Sal answered them with the barely concealed respect of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and could identify a sharp mind on contact. When it was done, she stacked the papers and looked up, and Gabriel was gone, called away by Torres for something operational, which happened constantly, and which he handled with a seamless return to the full engagement that had been absent for so long and was now simply the texture of how he moved through his days. She sat at the table alone for a moment and thought about Camden and her grandmother's kitchen, in a second-hand duffel bag, and a rolling cart of cleaning supplies, in the service entrance of a house she had known nothing about, in the shelf of nutrition supplement packets in the pantry that had told her everything she needed to know without anyone saying a word. She had not come here to save anyone. She had come here to work. She had come here because the references were good and the pay was adequate and the room had a decent mattress. She had cooked that first pot of stew because she was made the way she was made, because her grandmother had built her from the inside out with the belief that if someone near you was hungry, you fed them and you didn't make a production of it and you didn't expect anything back. You just fed them because that was the decent thing, and the decent thing was always available to you if you were willing to do it. She had not expected the rest of it. She had not expected Gabriel Navarro in all his complexity, in all his damage and authority, in the specific way he had of looking at things that he was trying to understand, direct, almost uncomfortably focused, without any of the social lubrication that most people used to make eye contact feel less like contact. She had not expected to come to know him the way she knew him now, which was well in the unadorned sense of that word. The way you know someone when you have watched them afraid and watched them heal and watched them become again the person they had been before someone tried to take everything from them. She picked up the signed papers and went to find Sal to talk about the specifics. On Friday, something happened that nobody in the mansion had expected. Gabriel called a household dinner. Not a rehearsal, not a strategic exercise, not a formal gathering with operational purpose. He asked Mrs. Hargrove to set the main dining table for 12 and to invite all senior household staff and all security personnel currently on rotation, and he told Bridget he wanted whatever she thought was right for 12 people on a Friday evening in late spring. Mrs. Hargrove came to find Bridget in the kitchen 45 minutes after receiving this instruction. She stood in the doorway and said, "He's serious." "I know," Bridget said. She was already pulling things from the refrigerator. "He has never done this," Mrs. Hargrove said. "In the 20 years, he has never sat down with household staff at a social dinner." "There's a first time for most things," Bridget said. Mrs. Hargrove stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she said quietly, with the careful precision of a woman who chose her expressions of sentiment with extreme selectivity, "Whatever you've done here, Miss Collins, whatever it is exactly that you've done, I want you to know that I am glad of it." Bridget looked up from the counter. Mrs. Hargrove's face was entirely composed, expression neutral, but her eyes were doing something that was unmistakably sincere. "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove," Bridget said. "Don't overcook the chicken," Mrs. Hargrove said and left. Bridget made roasted chicken with herb butter, braised greens with garlic, roasted potatoes, 2 kinds of bread that she had started that morning, because she had learned in the first week of a household this size to always make 2 kinds of bread, because people were divided on the question in ways that ran surprisingly deep. She made a salad and a simple pasta and a dessert that was her grandmother's apple cake with the brown sugar crust, which she had not made since Christmas because it required a particular kind of afternoon, and this afternoon had been the right kind. The dinner was at 7. 12 people sat at the table. Gabriel sat at the head. Torres sat to his right, which was where Torres always positioned himself. Mrs. Hargrove sat 3 seats down. Sal was there, and 3 of the security rotation and 4 household staff members who had been in the mansion long enough to have watched 6 chefs fail and had never once expected to be invited to dinner by the man they worked for. Bridget came out of the kitchen with the first dishes, and Gabriel stood up. Not because of the food. He stood up because she came through the door, and standing was what his body did, and he did not think about it first. She noticed. She registered it without making anything of it and set the dishes on the table and went back for the next course. And across the table, Torres watched the whole thing with the settled satisfaction of a man who has been loyal to someone for 12 years and is watching that person be happy and finds this to be entirely sufficient reward for 12 years of work. The dinner was loud in a way the mansion had not been loud in a very long time. People talked. Not carefully, not with the constant low-level monitoring of a room that might be dangerous, but just talked about things that had happened about the week, about Sal's ongoing feud with a parking structure near his office that he brought up approximately once a week and that everyone had opinions about. Gabriel ate a full plate and had seconds of the potatoes, which she noted without commenting. And he actually participated in the conversation as a person rather than presiding over it as a figure. And the people at the table responded to him the way people respond to someone they like and respect as opposed to someone they simply fear, which was different in ways that were visible and good. After dessert, when the table had softened into the comfortable aftermath of a real meal, Gabriel picked up his fork and tapped his glass. Not for quiet, there was enough quiet for what he wanted to do, just to mark the moment. "I want to say something," he said. 12 people looked at him. "This past year and a half," he said, "has been the most difficult period of my life. Not for reasons I'm going to explain in detail tonight. But I want to acknowledge it plainly because the people in this room lived through it with me, and they deserved a better version of this house than the one we've all been operating in." He paused. "I'm aware that some of you stayed when you had every reason to go. I don't take that lightly. I won't forget it." The table was quiet. Several people were looking at their plates in the specific way of people who are moved and are choosing not to demonstrate it. "There's a person in this room," he continued, "who has no reason to be here except that she showed up and did what she thought was right and didn't stop doing it when it became complicated. She didn't ask for recognition, and she's going to be irritated that I'm doing this, but some things need to be said out loud." Bridget, who was sitting at the far end of the table because she had arranged the seating and put herself at the far end because that was where she felt she belonged, looked up and found him looking directly at her. "Bridget Collins came to this house to clean floors," Gabriel said. "She stayed to do something considerably more important. And this household and this organization and I personally are here and functioning and at this table tonight because of what she did and how she did it." He lifted his glass. "That deserves more than I currently have the language for. But this is a start." 12 people lifted their glasses. Bridget sat at the end of the table and felt her face do something she had not quite planned for it to do, which was not cry, because she wasn't going to cry at a dinner table with 12 people watching, but come very close to crying in a way that required a certain amount of focused internal management. She pressed her lips together and lifted her own glass and said with the directness that was the most consistent thing about her, "Your grandmother would have done the same thing." She said it to him, not to the table, and he understood immediately what she meant, which was that she was returning the credit to something larger than herself, which was exactly what she would do, and which was exactly the thing about her that had made everything else possible. "My mother," he said quietly just to her, just across the length of the table in a way that the others could hear, but that was clearly meant for her specifically. "My mother would have loved you." The table absorbed this with the warm, instinctive recognition of people watching something real happen between two people, and then Torres said something to Paul about the parking structure, and the conversation resumed, and the evening carried on. Later, after the table had been cleared, and the staff had drifted away, and the house had settled into its late evening rhythms, Gabriel found Bridget in the kitchen, doing what she always did after a meal, working through the cleanup, with the steady, focused efficiency of someone who found the closing of a kitchen as satisfying as the opening of one. He came in and stood at the counter and did not offer to help because he had tried that once before, and she had handed him a dish towel and told him he was going to scratch the good pots, and he had in fact scratched one of the good pots, and the subject had been closed. "How bad was it?" she said, "the speech?" "It was not a speech," he said. "It was 4 sentences. It felt longer from where I was sitting." "You were fine," he said. "You were exactly fine." She rinsed the last pot and set it in the rack and dried her hands and turned around, and he was closer than she had realized, standing at the counter with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency and decreasing concealment for the past several weeks. And she looked at him for a moment, and then she said with the directness that she always came back to, because it was the only mode she fully trusted, "Gabriel, say the thing you are not saying." He looked at her. A long moment, the kind that has weight. "I think you know what I'm not saying," he said. "I think I do," she said. "I want you to say it anyway." He unfolded his arms. He stood up straight in the way he stood when he was not performing authority, but simply inhabiting it, and he said, "I don't want you to be here because it's your job. I want you to be here because you want to be here. And I'm aware those are two different things, and I'm aware that the situation between us has not been neutral for some time, and I'm aware that I am not a simple man to be involved with in any capacity. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She was looking at him steadily. "No," she said, "you're not simple. So I need you to know," he said, "that whatever you decide about that, your position here is not contingent on it. Your role, your compensation, your security in this house, none of that moves based on this conversation. I need you to know that before anything else." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think I didn't already know that?" He blinked. Gabriel, she said not unkindly. I've been watching you be a decent man in difficult circumstances for 6 weeks. I know what you are. I'm not worried about the contingency. He absorbed this. Then, I'm here because I want to be here, she said simply. I made that decision a while ago. I just wasn't going to say it first. The kitchen was very quiet. The house was settling around them, the sounds of an old building, releasing the day's tension, wood and stone doing what they do in the nighttime hours when the people inside them have stopped moving. He took one step toward her, and she did not step back, and he reached up and did what he had done once before at the counter, put his hand over hers where it rested on the edge of the sink. But this time it was not brief, and it was not comfort offered in a crisis. It was something else. Something that had been building for 6 weeks, from a pot of stew on a stormy night, and a woman who had not flinched, and a man who had been starving in every sense of the word, and had been fed in every sense of the word. And it was not dramatic. It was not a grand gesture. It was just two people standing in a kitchen that smelled like a good dinner and being honest with each other. Same time tomorrow, she said. He looked at her. The smile that had been approaching for 6 weeks, that had been hovering at the corner of his mouth in fragments, in half expressions and almost arrivals, finally came. Complete, real, his. Same time tomorrow, he said. The weeks that followed did not erase the difficulty of what had come before. The Dagan situation moved through legal and organizational channels, with the grinding deliberateness of consequence finally arriving, and there were meetings and decisions in a period of restructuring that required Gabriel's full and sustained attention, and got it. The South Side questions were addressed. The relationships that Dagan had been quietly distorting were examined and, where necessary, corrected. The men who had been navigating the uncertainty of the past year and a half adjusted to the reality of a Navarro leadership that was present, clear-eyed, and operating without the fog that had cost all of them in ways large and small. Gabriel worked 18-hour days for most of 3 weeks. He ate every meal. He ate breakfast in the kitchen, at 7 lunch, wherever the morning had taken him, and dinner at the table, usually with Torres, and sometimes with Sal, and occasionally with Bridget when her day and his aligned, and on the evenings when they did not align. And he came home at 10 or 11 to a kitchen that was quiet and clean. He would find something left in the refrigerator with a note on it. Not elaborate, not precious, just Bridget's handwriting telling him what it was and how long to heat it. The note of someone who had thought about him while he was elsewhere and done the practical thing about it. He heated the food. He sat at the kitchen table. He ate every time without exception. On a Saturday in late spring, almost 2 months after a stormy night, in a pot of beef stew, and a woman who had eaten first to show him it was safe, Gabriel called Bridget into his study. It was unusual. She generally came to the kitchen. He generally came to the kitchen. The kitchen had become the room in the house where they both existed most naturally, and the study was his operational space, the room where the machinery of the empire ran. She came in and sat across the desk from him, which she had not done before, and she looked at him with the same clear attention she had always given him and said, "What's happening?" He put a folder on the desk and slid it toward her. She opened it. Inside was a business registration document. The name on it was Collins Kitchen, LLC. The registered address was the Navarro Mansion. The ownership was 100% Bridget Collins. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked up. "I don't understand what this is," she said, though her voice suggested she was beginning to. "The household kitchen operation," he said, "and the catering for events, the staff meals, the formal dinners, all of it is a significant operational cost and has been listed internally as a household expense with no formal structure. I've restructured it as a separately registered entity, owned by you. The Navarro household is your primary client under a service contract." He paused. "What you build from there is your business." She was looking at the document. Her hands were flat on the folder the way they had been flat on the kitchen counter the night Torres came to tell her about Reyes pressing hard, managing something that was larger than she had room for in the moment. "Gabriel," she said. "You gave me back my life," he said. "I'm aware that sounds large. I'm not using the language carelessly. What you did in this house, what you chose to do repeatedly when you could have chosen to simply do your job and go to your room, it was the difference between me being here and me not being here. That has a value I cannot put in a folder. But I can put this in a folder, and I need you to accept it without arguing about it for at least 5 minutes." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in a way she was working to keep under control. 5 minutes, she said. At least 5, he said. She looked back at the document. She looked at her name on the registration. Collins Kitchen, LLC, the address where she had shown up with a duffel bag and a cleaning cart, not knowing anything about what was waiting inside. Your grandmother, he said quietly, she believed food was love. You told me that once. She did, Bridget said. She was right, he said. I know that now in a way I didn't know anything in a very long time. He paused. I want you to have this, not as payment, not as transaction, as acknowledgement of what you brought into this house, of what you are. She closed the folder. She pressed both hands flat on the cover of it and sat with her head slightly down for a moment, just breathing, just letting the weight of it settle into the right place inside her. Then she looked up. Her eyes were steady, clear. My grandmother also said, she said that when someone offers you something true, you say thank you and you mean it. You don't deflect it and you don't shrink from it. You just say thank you. He waited. Thank you, Gabriel, she said. You're welcome, Bridget, he said. The study was quiet. Outside Chicago moved through its Saturday afternoon, indifferent and alive, the city, doing what cities do with or without the dramas of the people inside them. And in the Navarro mansion, in a kitchen that had seen 6 failed chefs and 18 months of untouched plates and the slow-motion collapse of a powerful man's ability to trust the most basic thing, that the food on his plate would not kill him, that the people around him were not all waiting for his weakness, that something in the world was still safe and still good in that kitchen. At 7 the next morning, Bridget Collins made eggs. Low and slow, plenty of butter, the way her grandmother had taught her. And Gabriel Navarro sat at the island and drank his coffee and watched her hands and talked, and when she set the plate in front of him, he picked up his fork without hesitation, without fear, without any of the old machinery of dread that had once made eating feel like a kind of dying. He ate, he finished everything on the plate. And for the man who had almost disappeared entirely from the inside out, and for the woman who had walked into his fear with nothing but her grandmother's recipes and the absolute conviction that a hungry person deserved to be fed, that was not a small thing. That was not a routine morning. That was what it looked like when someone chose over and over and without fanfare to do the decent thing. And the decent thing turned out to be the thing that changed everything. The empire stood. The kitchen was warm. And Gabriel Navarro finally completely irrevocably knew how to eat again.